Imagine being locked out in the freezing cold, watching others feast inside, knowing no one cares. Then, out of nowhere, the most powerful being in the land, the Alpha King himself, finds you. What happens next? How does one night of freezing solitude turn into a royal decree that changes everything? Chapter 1. The Traitor's Shadow. The stone was cold. It seeped through the thin fabric of her trousers, a damp chill that felt like it was sinking right into her bones. Helen scrubbed, her knuckles raw and red against the unforgiving floor. The motion was automatic, back and forth, a rhythm of survival. Around her, the great hall buzzed with preparations, a symphony of clattering plates and rushed footsteps. No one saw her. She was just a part of the castle itself, as silent and ignored as the mortar between the stones. This was safety, she told herself, because to be seen was to be judged. From the kitchens, the scent of roasting boar and spiced wine drifted out, a cruel tease. It smelled like warmth. It smelled like belonging. Helen's stomach twisted into a tight, hungry knot, but the ache was familiar. She was used to being on the outside of everything, looking in. The daughter of a traitor learns to live on scraps of every kind. Two noble women, their silk gowns whispering secrets across the floor, paused near her. Their laughter was sharp, like chipping ice. "Look at her," one of them, Lady Anya, sneered. Her voice was just loud enough to be an accident. Scrubbing away her father's sins, as if she could ever wash away that stain. The other giggled. The Alpha King would be wise to cast her out completely. It's a disgrace she's even allowed to breathe the same air. Helen's shoulders hunched. Her world shrank to the small, soapy circle on the floor. Don't look up. Don't speak. Don't exist. She was a ghost, a smudge of dirt to be cleaned away. This was her place, her penance for a crime she didn't commit, but wore like a second skin. It was easier this way, wasn't it? To accept the narrative they wrote for her? Her father had been a protector, a loyal beta, and until he wasn't. The official story was simple. He betrayed the old king. But Helen remembered his eyes, the fierce love in them. It didn't make sense. It never did. The head steward, a stout man named Boris with a permanent scowl, clapped his hands. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the cavernous hall. "The feast begins in an hour. The Alpha King will be present. He expects perfection." His eyes scanned the room, dismissing the servants, critiquing the decor until they landed on Helen. They narrowed. "You, out." Helen froze, her rag dripping gray water onto the polished stone. "But I haven't finished the entryway." "You are finished for the night," Boris snapped, his tone leaving no room for argument. "No omega of your lineage will be present during the ceremonial feast. You are barred from this hall. Go to the kitchens and stay there. Better yet, go outside. I don't want to see your face again until the sun rises." Humiliation burned hotter than any fire. It was a public dismissal, a branding. Every servant nearby heard it. They looked away, some with pity, most with scorn. Being locked out was one thing. Being thrown out like trash was another. She scrambled to her feet, her body aching with a weariness that had nothing to do with scrubbing floors. She kept her head down, a curtain of mousy brown hair hiding her face as she scurried away. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of her tears, not here, not ever. The massive oak doors of the great hall were closing. The sounds of warmth, of laughter, of life were being sealed away from her. The lock clicked shut with a final metallic thud. Just before it closed, she saw the first torches being lit inside, casting a golden, welcoming glow. A world she could see, but never, ever touch. She was left in the corridor, where the cold was deeper and the shadows were long. But Boris's words echoed in her mind. Go outside. Fine. If she was a shadow, she would embrace the darkness. The small courtyard behind the kitchens would be her dining hall tonight. Alone. In the cold. It was fitting, she thought with a bitter pang. A feast of nothing for the girl who was nobody. The cold was a constant companion, but tonight it felt like it was trying to tell her something, that this emptiness was all she would ever deserve. Chapter 2. The Restless King. Inside, the heat was a physical presence. It pressed in on Mark from all sides, the roaring hearths, the crush of bodies, the suffocating weight of expectation. He sat on the Alpha King's throne, a monstrous thing of carved obsidian and silver, and felt like a prisoner. 100 conversations swirled around him, a meaningless drone of flattery and political maneuvering. They toasted his name, his strength, his pack. They saw the crown, the power, the title. They didn't see the man drowning beneath it. His wolf paced the cage of his ribs, a frantic, snarling thing. Trapped. Weak. It hated this. Hated the starched collar of his tunic, the polite smiles, the reek of perfume trying to mask the scent of ambition. His beast craved the hunt, the forest, the clean snap of bone. Not this gilded cage. For months, it had been getting worse. A rage that simmered just beneath his skin, a violence that threatened to spill over at the slightest provocation. His counsel called it the pressure of his duties. Mark knew it was something else. A sickness in his soul. A guilt he couldn't outrun. Lord Valerius, the ancient head of his council, leaned close. His breath smelled of spiced wine and decay. "My king, the pack needs a Luna. A strong match will stabilize your temperament. Lady Seraphina is of impeccable bloodline. An alliance with her family would secure our northern border." Mark's gaze drifted to the woman in question. Seraphina was beautiful, sculpted from ice and diamonds, cold, perfect, and utterly empty. She smiled at him, a predator's grin. Marrying her would be like shackling himself to an iceberg. It would be a political victory and a death of the spirit. He was supposed to find his fated mate, the one chosen for him by the moon goddess herself. But fate was a fickle bitch, and his wolf had remained silent, recognizing no one. The council was tired of waiting. They believed a political union was more practical than a myth. "The northern border is secure because I secured it," Mark said, his voice a low growl that cut through the nearby chatter. A ripple of silence spread from the throne. He hadn't meant for it to be so sharp, so aggressive. But his control was a fraying rope. He could feel their fear. Good. Fear was a tool. Fear kept them in line, but it was also in poison, isolating him completely. He pushed back from the table, the legs of his chair scraping against the stone. The room fell quiet. "I need air," he announced to no one in particular. He ignored the concerned look from Valerius, the calculating glance from Seraphina. He needed to escape before his wolf did it for him. The beast was clawing at him, demanding release, desperate for something real. Something that wasn't a lie wrapped in silk and pleasantries. He strode from the hall, his guards moving to follow. "Alone," he commanded, the single word cracking like a whip. They stopped, bowing their heads. The great doors opened for him and closed behind him, shutting out the oppressive heat and noise. The corridor was cooler, quieter. He breathed in the clean, crisp air of the winter night. It did little to soothe the inferno inside him. He felt wrong, fragmented. The man who was king and the beast who was wolf were at war, and they were tearing him apart from the inside. He walked without thinking, his feet carrying him down unfamiliar passages, away from the main parts of the castle. He was just following a desperate need for silence, for space. He rounded a corner into a small, forgotten courtyard. Snow was beginning to fall, soft, silent flakes dusting the cobblestones. And there, huddled against the stone wall, was a scent. It hit him like a physical blow. Not the cloying perfume from the hall, but something elemental, something wild. Lilac after a storm, winter frost. A hint of sorrow so profound it made his heart ache. His wolf, the raging monster that had been tearing him apart for months, suddenly went still. It stopped snarling. It stopped pacing. It lifted its head, and it purred. For the first time in years, the beast wasn't raging. It was yearning, drawn by an invisible string toward the source of that impossible scent. A figure was curled up in the shadows, barely visible. Mark's eyes, enhanced by his wolf's sight, adjusted to the gloom. He saw a small, shivering form, a girl, and his entire world, the one he ruled with rage and iron control, shattered into a million pieces. Chapter 3. The Spark in the Snow. The cold had a sound. It was the whisper of the wind snaking through the courtyard, the gentle hiss of snowflakes landing on stone. For Helen, it was the only company she had. She had her arms wrapped tight around her knees, trying to conserve every last scrap of body heat. The thin fabric of her servant's tunic was useless against the biting air. Shivers racked her body in unrelenting waves. She was so focused on the misery of it, on the rhythmic ache in her bones, that she didn't hear him approach. She smelled him first. Ozone, pine, and something fiercely masculine, like a gathering storm. It was a scent of raw power, of dominance. It cut through the cold, instantly overwhelming her senses. Her head snapped up. A figure stood in the archway, a silhouette against the distant torchlight from the castle. He was huge, broad-shouldered and radiating an intensity that made the air crackle. Even in the darkness, she knew who it was. No one else commanded the very space around them like that. The Alpha King. Panic seized her, a cold, sharp fear that had nothing to do with the temperature. She was not supposed to be here. She was not supposed to be seen by him. She scrambled to her feet, intending to flee, to melt back into the shadows where she belonged. But his eyes found hers. They were silver in the moonlight, molten silver. And they were staring at her as if he'd never seen another living soul. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The air grew thick, heavy, vibrating with a strange energy that pulled at the very center of her being. Something deep inside her, a part of her she never knew existed, woke up. It stretched, uncurled, and answered the silent call in his gaze. Mark took a step forward, then another. He moved with the predatory grace of a wolf stalking its prey, but his face held no aggression. It held shock, disbelief, a raw, aching vulnerability that was terrifying to witness on a man so powerful. Mate. The word didn't echo in the courtyard. It exploded in her mind. A single, possessive, undeniable truth that set every nerve in her body on fire. The cold vanished, replaced by a dizzying heat that started in her chest and spread through her veins like wildfire. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden, deafening silence. He was in front of her now, so close she could feel the heat rolling off his body. He lifted a hand, his fingers trembling slightly, and brushed a snowflake from her cheek. His touch was electric. A jolt of lightning shot through her, and she gasped. His eyes darkened, the silver swirling with black. A low growl rumbled in his chest, a sound so primal it bypassed her ears and resonated directly in her bones. It wasn't a threat. It was a claim. "You," he breathed, his voice rough, incredulous. Before she could process what was happening, his hand wrapped around her arm. His grip was like steel, inescapable, but not crushing. He wasn't hurting her. He was holding on to her as if she were the only solid thing in a collapsing world. Without another word, he turned and began pulling her back toward the castle. "No, wait!" Helen stammered, stumbling to keep up. I'm not allowed." He didn't slow down. He moved with a singular, unstoppable purpose. He kicked open a side door and dragged her into the warmth of the castle corridors. He was a force of nature, a storm she was caught in, and all she could do was be swept along. They passed shocked servants who flattened themselves against the walls, their eyes wide with disbelief. The sounds of the feast grew louder. The great oak doors were just ahead. "Please," she begged, her voice a terrified whisper. "They threw me out. I'll be punished." Mark stopped right before the doors. He turned to face her, his silver eyes blazing with an emotion she couldn't name. It was fury and tenderness, and a fierce possessiveness all rolled into one. He looked at her, truly saw her, the threadbare tunic, the smudge of dirt on her cheek, the fear in her eyes. Punished? He growled, the word a promise of violence. Anyone who touches you will answer to me. And then he threw the doors to the great hall open. The room, filled with the highest nobles of their kind, fell into a stunned, absolute silence. Every head turned, every eye fixed on them. On the mighty Alpha King, his face a mask of cold fury, holding the arm of the traitor's daughter, the dirty, invisible Omega who had been locked outside in the cold. He pulled her into the center of the room, into the golden light, and the scandal had just begun. Chapter 4. The Gilded Cage. The silence in the great hall was a living thing. It was heavy, suffocating, and filled with 1,000 unasked questions. Helen stood frozen in the center of the room, the Alpha King's hand still a brand of heat on her arm. Every noble, every courtier, every servant stared. She was a smudge of dirt on a pristine painting, an error in their perfect hierarchical world. She could feel the weight of their judgment, a physical force that made her want to curl into a ball and disappear. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a terrified bird trapped in a cage. Lord Valerius was the first to break the spell. He glided forward, his movements as smooth and dangerous as a snake's. "My king," he said, his voice a low purr that did nothing to hide his disapproval. His eyes flicked to Helen, dismissing her as one might an insect. "A moment of your time, in private." Mark's grip on her arm tightened. It wasn't painful, but it was possessive. Final. "What you have to say to me, Valerius, you can say in front of her." He seemed to stumble on the word, as if he didn't know what to call her. "As you wish," the old wolf said, a cruel smile touching his lips. "The council finds your choice of evening companion alarming. She is the daughter of a traitor, an Omega. Her presence here is an insult to your court and a mockery of the throne." Each word was a stone thrown at her. Helen flinched. She wanted the floor to swallow her whole. This was a nightmare. He had saved her from the cold only to throw her into the fire. "Her name is Helen." Mark's voice was a low growl, rumbling with a fury that made the air tremble. "And she is under my protection. She will not be insulted. She will not be harmed." "Protection?" Valerius scoffed. "Or your new pet. The pack needs a Luna, not a stray." Mark moved so fast he was a blur. He was suddenly face to face with the councilman, his silver eyes blazing with untamed power. "You forget who is king," he snarled. "You forget who commands here." He didn't shout, but his voice sliced through the tension, sharp and absolute. "Guards, escort Helen to my chambers. She will stay there until I command otherwise. No one is to approach her. No one is to speak to her." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room, daring anyone to challenge him. "Understood?" A chorus of nervous, "Yes, Alpha King," echoed back. Two guards, their faces impassive stone, stepped forward and gently guided a stunned Helen away. She was led through winding corridors and up a grand staircase, each step taking her further from the only life she'd ever known. They stopped before a set of massive carved oak doors. One guard opened it, and she was ushered inside. The room was bigger than the entire servants' wing. A fire roared in a stone hearth, casting a warm glow over rich tapestries, plush rugs, and a bed so large it could sleep a family. It was a prince's chamber, a king's. It was a prison made of silk and gold. A few minutes later, the door opened and closed. Mark stood there, the full force of his presence seeming to shrink the massive room. The argument started almost immediately. "Why?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Why would you do that? You've just painted a target on my back." "You were freezing to death," he stated, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "I would have been fine. It's better to be cold than to be this." She gestured wildly around the room. Your toy, your scandal, you've ruined me. A flicker of something, was it pain, crossed his face. I saved you. You sentenced me, she cried, frustration and fear making her bold. They will never let this go. They will tear me apart just to get to you. He stalked closer, his shadow swallowing her. Let them try, he growled, the sound vibrating deep in her chest. His silver eyes bored into hers, and for a moment, the space between them crackled with an energy that had nothing to do with anger. It was a raw magnetic pull, a silent question that neither of them knew how to answer. The king had caged her, but she was beginning to wonder who exactly was the prisoner here. Chapter 5. Scars of the King. After he left, storming out with a final, frustrated glance, Helen was left alone with the roaring fire and the deafening silence. She paced the length of the enormous chamber, her bare feet sinking into the plush softness of the carpets. It was a world away from the cold stone floors she knew. Everything here smelled of him. Pine, leather, and that wild, storm-like scent that was uniquely his. It was both intoxicating and terrifying. This was his space, his den, and she was trapped in it. Her curiosity warred with her fear. She ran a hand over a heavy velvet curtain, the fabric impossibly soft. She traced the intricate carvings on a wooden chest. But as she explored, she started to notice things, small details that didn't fit the perfect kingly image. The massive four-poster bed had a post that was slightly splintered near the base, as if something had struck it with incredible force. On the stone wall behind a tapestry, she found them. 4 deep gouges, spaced like a massive claw, had scraped down the rock. Who could do that to solid stone? Her fingers traced the marks, a shiver running down her spine. It looked like the work of something feral, something desperate to get out. She moved to the large, ornate wardrobe. It was made of dark, heavy wood, polished to a mirror shine. But on the back, hidden from casual view, she saw more marks. These were deeper, more violent. The wood was shredded in places, scarred by a frenzy of uncontrolled rage. A beast had done this. A cold dread trickled into her veins. The whispers about the Alpha King, his temper, his ferocity in battle were common knowledge. But this was different. This was not the work of a disciplined warrior. This was evidence of a complete loss of control. This was what his wolf did when it was caged. The door opened without a sound, and he was there. Mark looked exhausted. The fire in him seemed banked, replaced by a deep, weary tension in his shoulders. He saw her standing by the wardrobe, and his expression hardened. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice flat. Nothing," she stammered, pulling her hand back from the claw marks as if burned. He knew what she had seen. She could see it in the way his jaw tightened. He walked over to a table and poured himself a goblet of water, his movements stiff. "You shouldn't snoop," he said, not looking at her. "I wasn't snooping," she said softly. "The marks are hard to miss." "What happened?" "It's none of your concern." The words were a warning, a wall slamming down between them, but the bond, that strange, invisible thread connecting them, pulsed with his turmoil. She could feel his agitation, a chaotic energy buzzing just under his skin. She took a hesitant step closer. "Are you all right?" That simple question seemed to snap something inside him. "I'm fine!" he roared, spinning around. His eyes flashed from silver to a burning, predatory gold. A growl ripped from his throat. Not a sound of possession like before, but one of pure, unrestrained fury. He slammed the metal goblet down on the wooden table, and it crumpled in his grip like paper. Helen gasped and stumbled back, her heart leaping into her throat. For a split second, she didn't see a king. She saw a monster, a creature of raw, violent instinct, barely contained by human skin. He saw the fear on her face. The golden light in his eyes receded, replaced by immediate, crushing regret. He looked at his own hand, at the destroyed cup, as if he didn't recognize them. "Helen," he started, his voice a hoarse whisper. Knock, knock, knock. The sharp rap at the door shattered the moment. Mark straightened up, his kingly mask sliding back into place. "What is it?" he called out, his voice strained. A guard's voice came through the thick wood, formal and loud. "My king, Lord Valerius, insists on a word. He has brought Lady Seraphina with him. He says it is a matter of the pack's future." Chapter 6. The king's defense, Mark told the guards to wait. He looked at Helen, 100 emotions warring in his silver eyes. Regret, frustration, and something else. A silent plea. He straightened his tunic, the mask of the cold, untouchable king firmly in place once more. "Stay here, and stay silent," he commanded, his voice low but absolute. He opened the chamber doors just wide enough to step out into the private antechamber, leaving them slightly ajar. Helen, hidden in the shadows of the main room, could hear every word. "This is highly irregular, Valerius." Mark's voice was dangerously calm. "Desperate times, my king," came the old wolf's smooth reply. Then another voice, feminine and sharp as frosted glass. "We are all worried for you, Mark, for the pack." It was Lady Seraphina. "This distraction, it is beneath you." Helen shrank back, the word distraction branding itself onto her skin. That's all she was to them. A problem to be managed. "Her name is Helen," Mark said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And she is not a distraction." "She is a traitor's whelp who should be in the kennels," Seraphina snapped, her polite facade cracking. "The nobles are whispering. They see your father's weakness in you. He, too, was swayed by sentiment. Look where it led him." A tense silence followed. Helen held her breath. She was the weapon they were using against him. Her past, her bloodline. She was his weakness. The shame of it was a bitter pill. She should leave. She should run away and free him from this scandal. But then Mark spoke, and his voice was not the growl of a beast or the command of a king. It was something quieter and far more lethal. "My father is dead. I am not him," he said, each word precise and cold. "And you will not speak of Helen that way again." "Mark, be reasonable," Valerius started. "No, you be reasonable, old man," Mark interrupted, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was more menacing than any shout. "Let me make this clear, for all the whispering nobles you represent. Helen stays. She is mine to protect. Any insult to her is a challenge to me. Any threat against her is an act of treason against your king." He let the words hang in the air, a declaration of war. "Now get out." Helen heard the sharp intake of breath from Seraphina, the quiet rustle of fabric as they retreated. The antechamber door clicked shut. He had defended her. Not just defended her. He had drawn a line in the sand and placed her firmly on his side of it. He had claimed her not as a mate, but as his own territory, in front of the council, in front of his chosen political bride. The shame she felt moments before was washed away by a dizzying, terrifying wave of hope. It was a stupid, reckless feeling. But it was there. For the first time in her life, someone had stood in front of her instead of casting her aside. Someone had chosen her. Her life as a ghost was over. There was no going back to the shadows, no returning to the safety of being invisible. Mark had dragged her into the light, and now, the entire world was watching. She was no longer just Helen, the traitor's daughter. She was Helen, the Alpha King's controversy. And as the realization settled in, she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she had just become the most dangerous person in the entire kingdom. The council would not accept this. As the noble's footsteps faded down the hall, she thought she heard Valerius's voice, a faint, venomous whisper carried on the air. "If he will not remove her, we will." Chapter 7. Whispers and Embers. The days that followed blurred into a strange, dreamlike rhythm. Helen wore clothes made of soft wool instead of scratchy linen. She ate roasted chicken and warm bread from silver plates, the food delivered to the king's chambers by silent, wide-eyed servants. She slept in a bed so soft she felt like she was sinking into a cloud. Every part of her new life was a luxury she couldn't have imagined, and every moment of it felt like a lie. She was a stray dog dressed in silks, and she never forgot it for a second. The gilded cage was comfortable, but it was still a cage. Mark was a constant, brooding presence. He spent hours at a massive wooden desk near the fire, poring over maps and official documents. He rarely spoke to her, but she felt his awareness of her in every breath she took. The air between them was always thick with unspoken things, a low hum of energy that was both terrifying and thrilling. She learned the subtle shifts in his mood. The tightening of his jaw meant the council was pressuring him. The restless drumming of his fingers meant his wolf was pacing. One evening, he was standing by the hearth, staring into the flames. She was curled in a chair on the other side of the room, pretending to read a book. The silence stretched, tight and heavy. To get to the decanter of water on a side table, she had to walk past him. She tried to make herself small to slip by without disturbing the fragile peace, but the space was too narrow. Her arm brushed against his. It was barely a touch, wool against leather, but a jolt of pure lightning shot up her arm. She gasped and pulled back. He turned, his silver eyes dark and intense. The firelight danced in their depths, making them look like molten metal. He was so close enough to see the flicker of his pulse in his throat, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. "Helen," he breathed, and her name on his lips was a prayer and a curse. He leaned in. The world stopped. Her mind went completely blank, filled only with the scent of him, the sight of his mouth just inches from hers. Desire, sharp and undeniable, coiled low in her belly. It was a feeling so new, so powerful, it scared her more than any noble's scorn. This was it. This was the moment everything changed. But then he froze. A war raged in his eyes. The man versus the king versus the beast. With a low growl of frustration, he abruptly pushed himself away, turning his back to her. "This is a mistake," he muttered, more to himself than to her. The rejection was a physical slap. The warmth in her veins turned to ice. She fled back to her chair, her heart aching. Before she could process the hurt, a soft knock came at the door. It was a young servant girl named Alara, the only one who ever met her gaze, bringing her evening meal. As she set the tray down, Alara leaned in close, her voice a barely audible whisper. "Be careful, my lady," she murmured, not looking at Helen. "The whispers in the kitchens are getting worse. They're not just calling your father a traitor anymore." The girl swallowed hard. "They're saying he didn't just betray the old king. They say he was the one who held the knife." Chapter 8. The Beast's Protection. The next day, Mark was in a foul mood. He paced the chambers like a caged lion before finally stopping in front of her. "You need air," he declared. "We are walking in the gardens." It was not a request. Panic flared in her chest. To be seen with him outside in the open after yesterday's whispers? "I don't think that's a good idea." "I wasn't asking," he said, his tone final. He held out a heavy, fur-lined cloak. It was his. Resigning herself to the inevitable, she let him drape it over her shoulders. It was warm and smelled of him, a small comfort as he led her out into the lion's den. The castle gardens were beautiful, encased in high stone walls and dusted with a fresh layer of snow, but the beauty was lost on Helen. She could feel the eyes on them from every window, every balcony. She walked beside him, stiff and terrified, her head bowed. Just as she predicted, they were not left alone for long. Lady Anya, the same noblewoman who had mocked her in the great hall, appeared on the path ahead, flanked by two of her friends. They curtsied to Mark, their movements dripping with false deference. "Alpha King," Anya said, her voice sickly sweet. Her gaze slid right past him to fix on Helen. "How wonderful to see you taking pity on the less fortunate. Charity is such an admirable quality in a king." Her friends tittered. Helen flinched, pulling the cloak tighter around herself. The old Helen would have stared at the ground and willed herself to become invisible. It is a shame when a good family name is ruined by one man's treachery, Anya continued, her voice growing bolder. They say betrayal runs in the blood, like a disease. Something inside Helen snapped. Maybe it was the memory of her father's kind eyes. Maybe it was the near kiss by the fire. Maybe she was just tired of being a ghost. She lifted her chin and met the noblewoman's cruel gaze. "You know nothing about my father," she said. Her voice didn't shake. It was quiet, but it was as solid as the stone walls around them. Anya looked taken aback, then her face twisted in rage. "You dare speak to me, you little—" She never finished the sentence. A sound ripped through the quiet garden, a sound of pure, unrestrained fury. It was a growl that came from the depths of the earth, full of snapping teeth and primal rage. Mark was suddenly between them, his body transformed. His shoulders seemed broader, his posture lower, more predatory. His canines had elongated, sharp points gleaming against his lips. And his eyes were no longer silver. They were the solid gold of a wolf on the hunt. He lunged. It happened so fast, Helen barely saw it. One moment he was the king, the next he was a beast. He stopped a hair's breadth from Anya's throat, his snarl vibrating in the cold air. The woman screamed, a high, terrified shriek, stumbling backward and falling into the snow. Her friends scattered like frightened birds. Guards came running, their armor clattering. They hesitated, clearly terrified of touching their alpha in this state. "Mark!" Helen cried out, her own fear forgotten. Her voice cut through his rage. He froze, the gold in his eyes flickering. He looked at her, and for a second she saw a lost, tormented soul trapped inside the monster. He took a shuddering breath, the beast receding. Without a word, he turned and stalked away, leaving Helen alone with the terrified nobles and the silent, watching guards. As she stood there, trembling, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Serafina. She looked at the whimpering Anya on the ground, then turned her cold, calculating eyes on Helen. "See what you do to him?" she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "You are not his mate. You are his sickness. A true bond is meant to soothe the beast, not unleash it." She gave Helen a look of false pity. "That bond belongs to me, and when I claim it, I will be the one to heal him." Chapter 9. A crack in the bond. Serafina's words followed her back to the chambers, slithering into her mind and poisoning her thoughts. "You are his sickness." The phrase echoed over and over. She had seen the beast in the garden. She had seen the violence he kept chained just beneath his skin. Was Serafina right? Was her presence, this strange, chaotic bond between them, somehow making it worse? The thought was an agony, twisting the budding hope inside her into guilt. She felt like a ghost again, haunting the edges of his luxurious prison. When Mark returned hours later, he didn't speak of what happened. He couldn't even look at her. The silence between them was no longer filled with electric tension. It was a cold, empty chasm. That night, she couldn't sleep. She was huddled in the chair by the dying fire when she heard voices from the antechamber. Mark's and Valerius's. She knew she shouldn't listen, but she was powerless to move. "An utter disaster!" Valerius's voice was a low, furious hiss. "You nearly killed the daughter of a duke in the royal gardens. The court is in an uproar. They see your control slipping. They see a king ruled by a feral impulse for an omega." "I had it under control," Mark bit back, but his voice lacked conviction. It sounded tired, so incredibly tired. "Did you?" the old wolf challenged. "This bond you think you have, look at what it does. It makes you reckless. It turns you into a beast you cannot manage. The pack requires stability. A king must be master of himself before he can be master of others. Is this girl worth your crown? Is this what the moon goddess truly intended for you? This chaos?" Helen's heart clenched. She pressed a hand to her mouth, holding her breath, praying for Mark to defend her, to defend them. There was a long, heavy pause. When Mark finally spoke, his voice was a broken whisper, filled with a despair that shattered her heart into a million pieces. "I don't know," he confessed. The words were heavy with defeat. "My wolf." It recognized her. "I have never felt anything like it, but this rage, it's tearing me apart." "Maybe you are right, Valerius. Maybe this is all a terrible mistake." He took a ragged breath. Maybe fate got it wrong. The world fell away. The fire, the room, the castle. It all disappeared. There was only the sound of his words, his doubt, confirming every single fear she had ever had about herself. She was a mistake, unworthy, a sickness. The one person she thought might save her from the cold had just admitted he believed she belonged there. The fragile, invisible thread of the bond between them didn't just crack. It felt like it had been sliced clean through by the blade of his doubt. The conversation continued, but she barely heard it. The words were a dull drone in the background of her pain. Then, Valerius's voice cut through the fog, sharp and final. "The border lords will not wait for you to sort out your feelings. They demand a royal betrothal to stabilize the region. You have until the blood moon to announce your engagement to Lady Seraphina. If you fail, they will see it as a sign of weakness and challenge your claim to the throne." He paused. "Choose, my king. Your kingdom or the girl, or the—" Chapter 10. I am not your shame. The morning light felt different. Yesterday, it had streamed through the large windows of the king's chamber with a soft, golden promise. Today, it was a harsh, interrogating white that exposed every speck of dust and every crack in her heart. Helen sat on the edge of the bed, the fur blanket pooled at her waist, but she felt a cold that no fire could touch. His words, a terrible mistake, maybe fate got it wrong, had become her reality. She was his error, his burden. When Mark entered the room, he looked like a man who hadn't slept. The guilt was etched on his face, a shadow in his silver eyes. He stopped, seeing her awake and dressed in the simple servant's tunic she had arrived in. She had cast aside the fine clothes he'd given her. She would not wear the costume of his mistake. "Helen," he began, his voice rough, "about what you heard." "Was it the truth?" she asked, her own voice startlingly clear and steady. The pain had burned away all her fear, leaving behind a brittle, defiant calm. She rose to her feet and faced him. "Am I your mistake, my king?" He flinched as she threw his own words back at him. "It's not that simple." "It feels simple to me," she said, taking a step closer. The wounded Omega was gone, replaced by a woman with nothing left to lose. "I have spent my entire life being invisible because I am the daughter of a traitor. I have lived on scraps and whispers, and I accepted it because I thought that was all I deserved. But I will not be your hidden shame. I will not be a political problem you debate with your council and then discard when I become inconvenient." Her voice trembled, but not with fear, with a raw, aching fury. "If I am a mistake, then have the courage to say it to my face and cast me out. Don't let me haunt the corners of your life while you decide if your crown is worth more than your soul." Her challenge hung in the air between them, sharp and glittering. He stared at her, a look of stunned disbelief on his face. He had expected tears, not a sword. At that moment, the chamber doors opened and a guard bowed. "My king, the court is assembled. It is time." The ultimatum from the border lords, the blood moon, the choice. It was here. Mark's eyes were locked on hers, a silent, desperate battle raging within them. He was torn between the woman who was his mate and the kingdom that was his duty. He walked past her, his face a mask of cold stone. She followed him out of the room, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. She didn't know why she followed, only that she had to see this through to its bitter end. The throne room was filled with nobles. Valerius stood near the throne, a smug look of victory on his face. Seraphina was beside him, looking every bit the queen-in-waiting. They all turned as Mark entered, their eyes flicking from him to the dirt-smudged Omega trailing in his wake. Mark ascended the dais and turned to face his court. He looked over all of them, the schemers, the loyal, the hungry, but he did not look at her. There has been speculation, he began, his voice ringing with cold authority, regarding the presence of the Omega, Helen. He spoke her name as if it were a foreign word. She was granted sanctuary within these walls due to a misunderstanding. That sanctuary is now revoked. The words hit her like a physical blow. Her presence has been a disruption to the duties of the crown, he continued, his voice void of all emotion. Her stay is over. She will be escorted from the castle grounds at once. He finally looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw not anger, but an abyss of agony. He was trying to save her life by destroying her. She is nothing to me. Chapter 11. The Lunar Fire. Nothing. The word echoed in the sudden predatory silence of the throne room. It ricocheted inside Helen's skull, a death knell for the fragile hope she had dared to nurture. The faces of the court swam before her, smirking, triumphant, pitiful. Seraphina's smile was a slash of victory. Valerius nodded, his plan perfectly executed. The king had chosen his kingdom. He had chosen to leave her in the cold. She felt the bond, that invisible elemental connection to Mark that had burned in her chest since the moment they met. It had been cracked by his doubt, but now, with his public rejection, it shattered. The pain was unimaginable. It was not a feeling, it was a physical event. A spear of absolute zero drove through her heart and every nerve in her body screamed. Her vision went white. The world dissolved into a roar of static. Her legs gave out from under her, and she collapsed toward the stone floor. But something happened on the way down. As her connection to him broke, another connection was forged. Something ancient and powerful, asleep in her blood for her entire life, was violently shocked awake. It was as if a dam inside her soul had burst. A wave of ice-cold power surged through her veins. The torches in the hall didn't just flicker. They erupted in columns of white-hot silver fire. The air, once warm and stuffy, dropped 20 degrees in a heartbeat. A delicate, intricate pattern of frost spread out from her body, racing across the polished marble floor in beautiful, lethal fractals. The nobles cried out, stumbling back as the unnatural cold washed over them. Helen stopped falling an inch from the ground. She hung there for a moment, suspended by a power that was not her own, before her feet settled gently on the floor. She rose to her full height, no longer the cowering Omega. Her head was held high. When she opened her eyes, they were no longer the simple brown of a servant. They glowed with a soft, internal moonlight. She was heartbroken. She was shattered. But she was powerful. She looked at the court, at the fear on their faces, and felt a strange calm settle over her. She was not their plaything. She was not his mistake. She was something else. Something they had forgotten to fear. Her gaze finally landed on Mark. He was staring at her, his face a mask of utter shock, horror, and a terrifying, dawning awe. He had thrown away a stone and uncovered a star. Amid the chaos and panicked whispers, one man was not afraid. An old, wiry lord from a minor house, a man named Cale who had served with her father, stared at her with wide, disbelieving eyes. It wasn't fear on his face. It was recognition. He breathed a single, reverent word, a name from a forgotten age, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. Lumaris. Chapter 12. A Traitor's Loyalty. Mark felt like the floor had been ripped out from under him. He had just condemned his mate, torn his own soul in two, to save her from the wolves in his court. He had chosen duty, chosen the crown, chosen a life of hollow misery to keep her safe. And in response, the universe had mocked him. Helen was not a helpless Omega. She was a miracle. A terrifying, beautiful, frost-wielding miracle. The word Cale had whispered, Lumaris, echoed in the king's mind, a key to a lock he never knew existed. He had dismissed his stunned court and retreated to his private study. The image of her glowing eyes burned into his memory. He had shattered them both for nothing. Valerius had tried to follow, already spinning a tale of dark magic, of witchcraft that needed to be purged. Mark had slammed the door in his face. An hour later, there was a quiet knock. It wasn't a servant or a guard. It was Lord Kale. "Alpha King," the old wolf said, his eyes still wide with the wonder of what he'd seen. "I must speak with you. What I have to say, it changes everything you think you know." Mark, desperate for answers, let him in. "What was that word you said? Lumaris?" "It is not a word. It is a bloodline," Kale explained, his voice trembling with the weight of the secret he had kept for 2 decades. "A line of powerful she-wolves who carry the light of the moon in their veins. They are not omegas, they are protectors, guardians. Helen's mother was one. And her father was their sworn shield." Mark sank into his chair. "Her father was a traitor. He killed my father." "No!" Kyle's denial was fierce. "That is the lie the council told to cover the old king's shame. Your father had grown ambitious. He was dabbling in shadow magic, trying to find a way to enhance the power of the royal bloodline. Helen's father, Leon, warned him against it. He pleaded with him to stop." Kale leaned forward, his old eyes burning with conviction. "The night the king died, he was performing a dangerous ritual. It went wrong. A shadow creature was summoned, a thing of pure rage. Leon died fighting it, giving his life to save your father's. But the beast still killed the king before it was banished." He sat back. "Valerius's predecessor, Lord Fane, found their bodies. To hide the old king's disgrace and secure his own council's power, he invented the story of betrayal. He branded a hero a traitor and orphaned his magical child, hoping her power would never awaken. The truth was a physical blow. Guilt, black and suffocating, crushed Mark. He had built his reign on a lie. He had trusted the wolves who murdered his mate's family in name, if not in deed. He had publicly shamed the daughter of the man who had died for his father. The rage he'd felt before was a flickering candle compared to the inferno that now consumed him. His target was no longer his own beast. It was his court. His path was suddenly, brutally clear. Forget the crown. Forget duty. He had to find Helen. He had to beg for her forgiveness. He had to burn the liars from his kingdom. As this new resolve hardened in his soul, the study doors burst open. A scout, breathless and pale with terror, stumbled into the room. "Alpha King!" the man gasped, collapsing to one knee. "Forgive the intrusion, but it is an emergency. Alpha Riker of the Black Moon Pack has breached the northern border with his entire war host." Mark was on his feet in an instant. "Riker? Why?" The scout looked up, his face grim. "He has sent a rider with a declaration, my lord. He cites your instability. He claims your public rejection of a fated Lumaris mate is an offense against the goddess and a sign of your unfitness to rule." The scout hesitated. "He issues a formal challenge for the throne, and he claims the Lumaris as his rightful prize." Chapter 13. The Hunter and the Moon. The throne room, the castle, the entire life she'd never really had, Helen left it all behind. She ran, not like a frightened servant, but like a creature escaping a trap. Lord Kale, the old wolf who knew her name, had found her in the chaos and guided her out through a series of forgotten tunnels. He led her to a small, abandoned hunter's cabin deep within the royal woods, a place of safety where she could finally breathe. The power that had erupted from her now slumbered uneasily beneath her skin, a low hum of energy she didn't understand or control. It felt like a second heartbeat, one made of moonlight and frost. She sat on the cabin's dusty porch, staring at the moon. She would not be a prize. She would not be a political pawn or a supernatural weapon. She would leave this kingdom, leave this continent if she had to, and find a place where she could just be Helen. A twig snapped in the darkness. She was on her feet in an instant, the cold energy inside her flaring to life. A figure stepped out of the tree line. It wasn't one of Riker's wolves, nor a member of the council. It was Mark. He looked haggard, his royal clothes torn from his relentless path through the forest. He stopped 20 feet away, holding his hands up in a gesture of peace. He looked broken. "Helen," he said, his voice raw with exhaustion and regret. "You are not welcome here," she replied, her voice as cold as the power flowing through her veins. "You made your choice. You chose your crown." "I chose wrong," he said, taking a slow step forward. "I chose to protect you by hurting you, and it was the act of a fool and a coward. I came to tell you the truth, and to beg for your forgiveness." He told her everything. He told her about her father, Leon, the hero branded a traitor. He explained the council's decades-long lie, the shadow magic his own father had dabbled in, and the sacrifice that had saved the throne. He confessed that he had been a king ruling a kingdom built on a foundation of lies. Every word chipped away at the wall of ice around her heart. She wanted to hate him. She needed to hate him. But the fractured bond between them pulsed with the raw, undeniable sincerity of his pain. He wasn't speaking as a king. He was speaking as a man who had lost his soul. "Even if it's true," she whispered, her anger warring with a deep, treacherous longing. "What does it change? You still threw me away. I will not be caged again, Mark. Not by your enemies, and not by you." "I would never cage you," he pleaded, taking another step. "I would give you the world." Suddenly the woods around them came alive. Figures dropped from the trees, surrounding them in a circle of drawn swords. They were the king's own royal guard. And stepping from behind a large oak, his face calm and disappointed, was Lord Valerius. "Such a shame," Valerius said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "The king has clearly been compromised by this creature. He is no longer fit to rule." He smiled, a thin, cruel expression. For the good of the pack, he must be relieved of his duties, permanently. Chapter 14. The Serpent's Guile. The betrayal was so absolute, it was stunning. Valerius, Mark's mentor, the man who had guided him, advised him, and shaped his reign. The serpent had been coiled at his feet the entire time. "You," Mark snarled, his voice a low rumble of disbelief and fury. He moved to stand in front of Helen, shielding her with his body. "You did this. The border lords. The pressure." "Politics is the art of applying pressure, my boy," Valerius said with a condescending sigh. "You are becoming sentimental, unpredictable. Your father made the same mistake." He gestured dismissively. "It was I who sent word to Alpha Riker. A rival with a legitimate claim is so much cleaner than a simple coup. He will take the throne and I will guide him. The pack needs a firm traditional hand, not one softened by an Omega distraction." A cold wave of guilt washed over Helen. She remembered weeks ago, passing Valerius in a hall. He had stopped, offered her a kind word, a look of pity for her plight. It hadn't been kindness. It had been assessment. He had been studying the king's weakness, and she had been at the center of it. She had trusted the gentle words of the snake while cursing the tormented heart of the lion. "You are the traitor," she breathed, the realization settling like a stone in her gut. Valerius's eyes flickered to her, and for the first time, she saw true malice in them. "The lie has held this kingdom together for 20 years. I will not let a resurrected ghost and a lovesick king destroy that stability." He gave a sharp nod. "Take them." The guards advanced. But Mark was not the same man who had sat conflicted on a throne. This was an alpha whose mate was threatened, whose family was dishonored. He roared, a sound of pure, righteous fury, and met their charge. Helen didn't think. She reacted. As a guard lunged at Mark's exposed back, she threw out her hand. A wave of shimmering, ice-cold air blasted from her palm, and the guard was thrown back, his armor covered in a layer of glittering frost. The power was wild, untamed, but it was hers. They fought back to back, a king and his forgotten queen, a storm of steel and a whisper of frost. Mark was a whirlwind of controlled violence, his rage finally given a worthy target. Together, they were overwhelming. The traitorous guards fell back, their resolve faltering. Mark disarmed the last man and turned on Valerius, his eyes blazing with golden light. The old wolf did not look afraid. He simply reached into his cloak and pulled out a large curved horn. "You may have the strength of a beast, boy," he said with a smirk. "But I have the law." He lifted the horn to his lips and blew a single piercing note that echoed through the dark woods. Moments later, the sound of heavy footfalls answered. A new group of wolves emerged from the trees, larger, wilder, their eyes glowing with predatory hunger. At their head was a massive alpha with a cruel, scarred face. "Alpha Riker." Valerius lowered the horn. "The formal challenge for the throne has been witnessed. It will take place at dawn on the day of the blood moon," he announced, his voice ringing with triumph. "As is the ancient law." Chapter 15, A Vow in the Dark Alpha. Riker stepped forward, his enormous frame seeming to suck the very air from the clearing. His eyes, small and black like chips of obsidian, raked over the scene before settling on Helen. A hungry, possessive smile spread across his scarred face. "So this is the Lumaris prize," he grunted, his voice a low rumble. Valerius did not exaggerate. "She smells of moonlight." He looked at Mark with open contempt. "And you are the fool who threw her away. You are not fit to be a king." Mark stood his ground, a bulwark of defiance between Helen and the rival Alpha. His fury was a palpable force, radiating from him in waves. "She is not a prize," he growled, "and you will not touch her." He formally accepted the challenge with a sharp nod. "I will meet you on the field of combat, but know this, Riker. I am not fighting for a crown. I am fighting for her." He risked a glance back at Helen, and in that fleeting moment, all his regal authority melted away, leaving only the desperate man, the mate. His voice dropped, meant only for her. "I was wrong. I was a fool. I will not lose you again." His eyes burned with a vow that was more sacred than any coronation oath. "I will die before I let him lay a hand on you." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. All the lingering anger, all the hurt, dissolved in a wave of terrifying, all-consuming fear. Not for herself, but for him. To lose him now, just when she had found him, was an agony she could not bear. The bond between them, fractured and strained, flared to life with a desperate, protective fire. She loved him. In the face of death, it was the only truth that mattered. Riker let out a short, brutal laugh. "Touching vows. But I have no time for honor." He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible signal. One of his warriors, moving with blinding speed, threw something into the air. A fine, silvery powder rained down over the clearing. "Silvervine." Mark roared as he inhaled the dust, the scent of the potent werewolf paralytic hitting his system. His body seized up, his immense strength draining away in an instant. He staggered, fighting to stay upright, his eyes wide with fury and disbelief. "Mark!" Helen screamed. She tried to summon her power, to call on the frost and moonlight, but it was too late. Riker's warriors surged forward. They overwhelmed Mark, forcing him to his knees, his muscles locked and useless. Before Helen could even move, Riker was on her. His hand, as big as her head, clamped around her arm like a manacle. His scent was foul, stale blood and bitter earth. "The prize comes with me," he snarled, his grip bruising. He began to drag her away, back toward his war party. She fought, she struggled, but he was immensely powerful. She looked back and saw Mark on his knees, helpless, forced to watch as the rival Alpha stole his mate away from him. His eyes met hers, and the agony in them was the last thing she saw before she was pulled into the darkness of the woods. Chapter 16. The Black Moon Prison. Helen's new world was made of mud, sweat, and the stench of unwashed bodies. Riker's war camp was a brutal, sprawling mess of crude tents and sullen warriors. She was chained inside the Alpha's personal tent, the iron cuffs laced with threads of silver that felt like ice against her skin, leeching the strength from her limbs and dulling the nascent power within her. The constant, low-level pain was a reminder of her captivity. She was a prize, displayed in a cage for all to see. Riker would visit her, his presence filling the tent with a suffocating arrogance. He would eat a piece of roasted meat in front of her, telling her of his plans to tear down the kingdom Mark had built. "Your king is weak," he sneered one evening, tossing a bone to the floor. "He feels too much. An alpha rules with his fangs, not his heart." Helen said nothing, turning her face away. Her silence only seemed to amuse him. He moved closer, crouching in front of her. "You do not understand what you are, Lumaris," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The old tales are true. Your bond is different, more powerful. It is not limited to a single sentimental fool." A cold dread crept up her spine. "What are you talking about?" "The mate bond you felt? It is a bond of the soul, but a Lumaris can form a second connection. A bond of power," he explained, his eyes glittering with a dark light. "It can only be forged with an alpha of a dominant bloodline, like mine. It will not feel like love. It will feel like lightning, like a crown." He reached out and touched her cheek, his calloused fingers shockingly cold. When his skin met hers, she felt a sickening jolt. A faint, disgusting echo of the mate pull, twisted and wrong. It was a phantom, a mimicry of the real thing, but it was there. It felt like a violation, a dark magic that sought to overwrite the sacred connection she had with Mark. Doubt, cold and sharp, pierced through her grief. What if he was right? What if the one pure magical thing she had ever known was not unique? What if it could be stolen or duplicated? If fate could be so easily manipulated, then what was the point of anything? Her entire world, already fractured, began to crumble. As she reeled from the shock, a commotion erupted outside the tent. A warrior, caked in mud and blood, burst in and knelt before Riker, gasping out a report. Riker listened, a slow, brutal smile spreading across his face. He stood up and looked down at Helen, his expression one of pure triumph. "It seems your former king is not as mighty as his reputation suggests," he announced, his voice booming in the small space. "His first assault on my lines has been crushed. His loyalists are scattered and broken." He let the words sink in, twisting the knife. "He is wounded, and he is utterly alone." Chapter 17. The Wounded Lion. The forest floor was damp and cold beneath him. Mark's side was a blaze of agony, the gash from a silver-laced blade burning with a venomous fire that seeped deep into his bones. The silver vine from the ambush was still in his system, making his limbs feel heavy as lead, his wolf sluggish and weak. His first attack had been a disaster. Driven by a desperate, reckless need to get Helen back, he had led his few remaining loyalists into a trap. He had been arrogant, and he had paid the price. Lord Kale and a handful of surviving warriors found him leaning against a tree, trying to staunch the bleeding. The defeat was a bitter poison in his throat, but the true wound was the emptiness where Helen should be. "My king, you are bleeding badly," Kale said, his old face etched with worry. "We must get you to safety." Before they could move, another party of wolves emerged from the shadows. It was Valerius, flanked by several powerful lords of the council who had sided with him. They were not here to help. Valerius looked at Mark's wounded state, at his ragged soldiers, and his expression was one of cold, clinical satisfaction. "Look at him," he said, his voice projecting for all to hear. "This is your king, beaten in his first battle, bleeding in the dirt, his fated mate captured by a superior alpha." He shook his head in mock sorrow. "He cannot lead this pack. He cannot even protect what is his. He is unfit to rule." The words struck Mark harder than any blade, because a part of him, the part that had been eaten away by guilt and self-doubt for months, believed it. He had failed. His rage, his loss of control, his rejection of Helen, it had all led to this. He had brought this ruin upon them all. He was exactly the weak, sentimental fool his enemies claimed he was. The guilt over Helen was a monster, consuming him from the inside out. He had failed to protect her. He was broken. He stared at his hands, covered in his own blood. He was hopeless. It was in that moment of absolute despair, his body weakened by poison and his spirit crushed by failure, that the final thread gave way. The bond, the faint, humming connection to Helen that had sustained him across the distance, the last ember of hope in the darkness of his soul. Stretched thin by his rejection, by her capture, by his own utter hopelessness. It snapped. It was a feeling beyond pain. A profound spiritual silence. A void. The part of his soul that was intrinsically linked to hers simply vanished. Mark threw his head back and roared. It was not a sound of anger or of a king. It was the sound of a soul being ripped in two, an agony so complete and so final that it silenced the birds in the trees and made even his enemies take a step back in fear. He had lost her. For good. Chapter 18. The Silence of the Moon. Helen was staring at the silver threads in her chains when it happened. One moment, the faint, comforting hum of Mark's presence was a distant star in the black sky of her despair. The next, the star went out. It didn't fade. It didn't flicker. It snapped. The connection, the invisible lifeline that had tied her soul to his, vanished. The silence it left behind was absolute, a crushing void that was more profound than any sound. Her breath hitched. Her heart stopped. She knew, with a certainty that defied all reason, what that silence meant. In the lore of their people, a fated bond was eternal. It could only be broken by one thing: death. He was gone. Riker's warrior hadn't been lying. Mark had been defeated, wounded, alone, and now he was dead. The finality of it was a wave of ice that washed over her, extinguishing every last ember of warmth, of hope, of fight. The world turned gray. Riker's taunts, Valerius's betrayal, her own burgeoning power. None of it mattered anymore. The center of her universe had just collapsed into nothing. Riker entered the tent, a smug look on his face. He must have felt the bond break as well. "It is done," he said, his voice lacking any sympathy. "Your weakling king is gone. The path is clear. Accept it. Accept me. Be my queen, and you will have power you've never dreamed of. Refuse, and you will fade into nothing." And she nearly did. The old Helen, the worthless Omega, the traitor's daughter, rose up to claim her. What was the point? Her protector was gone. Her love was gone. Her hope was a ghost. To surrender, to accept the bleak reality and let the darkness take her, seemed like a mercy. She could just stop. Stop fighting. Stop feeling. This was her crucible. The moment of utter despair. Was her worth, her power, her very existence tied to him, or was it her own? She looked down at her hands chained in silver. She felt the emptiness in her soul where the bond used to be. It was a gaping wound. But as she focused on that absolute silence, she felt something else. Deep within the void, a tiny flicker. It was not Mark. It was not the bond. It was a spark of cool, quiet light. It was the power of the moon, the lumaris magic that was her birthright. It hadn't come from him. He had not given it to her. His presence had only been the key that unlocked the door to a room that had always been hers. The bond had not been her strength. It had only shown her where her true strength was hidden. Her despair did not vanish, but it changed. It sharpened. It crystallized into a diamond-hard point of resolve. She was not defined by the man she had lost. She would be defined by the legacy he had died protecting. The legacy of her father. The legacy of her own power. She slowly lifted her head. When her eyes met Riker's, they were no longer clouded with grief. They were glowing with a calm, cold, silver fire. He took an involuntary step back. The broken Omega was gone. A queen was about to rise from her ashes. Chapter 19. Queen of Frost and Fire. Riker saw the change in her eyes and stumbled back, a flicker of genuine fear crossing his brutish features. The broken Omega was gone. In her place was something ancient and terrible. Helen focused on the spark of power within her, the cool light she had mistaken for a reflection of Mark's strength. She understood now. It was not a reflection. It was the source. Her grief for Mark, a cold black stone in her soul, became the fuel. Her rage at her captors, a simmering heat, became the forge. The love she still felt, a fierce, unwavering loyalty, became the light. The silver glow emanating from her intensified, brightening, until it was no longer a soft moonlight but a brilliant, searing incandescence. It was fire made of winter's heart, lunar fire. It did not radiate heat. It pulsed with an absolute purifying cold that made the very air crystallize. She lifted her chained hands. She finally realized the truth that had eluded her entire life. Her worth had never been a question for others to answer. It was not determined by her rank as an Omega, her shame as a traitor's daughter, or even her destiny as a fated mate. Her worth was her own. She was Helen. She was Lumaris, and she would not be caged. Focusing her will, she poured the cold fire into the silver-laced chains. They didn't melt. The metal screeched, instantly flash-freezing and becoming impossibly brittle. With a sharp cry, she slammed her wrists down. The chains shattered like glass, falling to the floor in 1,000 glittering pieces. Riker stared, his jaw slack with disbelief. "Guards!" he bellowed. They surged into the tent, but they were too late. Helen rose to her feet and unleashed her power. A wave of shimmering, white-cold fire erupted from her, not to kill, but to command. The ground froze in its path. The tent poles cracked with frost. The warriors cried out as the unnatural cold seized their limbs, their movements becoming sluggish and clumsy. In the chaos, she ran. She burst from the tent into the heart of the war camp. Wolves turned, snarling, but hesitated as they saw the glowing woman who moved like a winter storm. She was a vision of myth and terror, and it gave her the precious seconds she needed. She fled into the dark woods, not looking back. She was no longer running from her past. She did not know if Mark was truly dead, or if the breaking of the bond was a trick of pain and distance. But it no longer mattered. If he was alive, she would find him. She would save him. If he was dead, she would avenge him. She would burn his enemies from the world with her cold, silent fire. She was no longer a victim of this story. She was the storm that was coming for its end. Chapter 20. The Healer's Touch. An instinct she didn't understand guided her through the dark forest. It was a pull, not of the broken bond, but of her own luminous blood, a deep, primal connection to the royal line she was sworn to protect. It led her to a hidden ravine where the last of Mark's loyalists had gathered. It was a place of defeat, smelling of blood and despair. And she saw him. Mark was laid out on a bed of cloaks, Lord Kale kneeling beside him. He was pale as death, his breathing shallow. A dark, ugly wound festered on his side, oozing a black poison that even her untrained eyes recognized as the work of silver. He was dying. The breaking of the bond hadn't been a trick. It was the result of his life force fading into nothing. Tears streamed down her face, freezing on her cheeks. But this was not the time for grief. It was the time for action. She pushed her way through the stunned warriors and dropped to her knees at his side. "My queen?" Kale breathed, his eyes wide with awe and hope. Helen placed her hands over Mark's wound. She closed her eyes and called to the power within her. She had used it for defense, for escape. Now, she would use it to heal. The lunar fire flowed from her palms, but this time it was not a raging torrent. It was a gentle, steady stream of pure, silver light. It sank into his skin, not with cold, but with a soft, cleansing warmth. She could feel the silver poison, a vile, living corruption, recoiling from her light. She pulled at it, drawing it out of his flesh and into her fire, where it was consumed and purified. But the wound was not just physical. His spirit, his very wolf, was shattered. She pushed her power deeper, past flesh and bone, until it touched his soul. She found the void where their bond used to be, and into that emptiness, she poured her own essence, her own strength. She was not fixing what was broken. She was offering something new, a connection forged not by fate, but by choice, a bond between two sovereigns, two equals. His eyes snapped open. They were silver again, and they were filled with her. He saw her, not as the Omega he'd rejected, but as the magnificent, powerful queen who had just saved his life. The guilt and shame that had crippled him were incinerated in the light of her grace. "Helen," he rasped, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. "I'm here," she whispered, her tears falling freely now. "I thought you were gone." "Never," he vowed, his voice gaining strength with every passing second. "Not from you." They had been torn apart by doubt and duty. Now they were reforged in sacrifice and power. As the last of her healing light faded, they were no longer just fated mates. They were a king redeemed by his queen, and a queen who had finally claimed her own crown. Lord Cale approached them, his face grim, but his eyes shining. "My king, my queen," he said, and the title felt right, earned. Riker's army is on the move. The blood moon rises. The challenge begins at its apex. Chapter 21. Vows under a scarlet moon. The sky was bleeding. The rising blood moon cast a sickly crimson light over the ravine, painting the world in shades of rust and shadow. The air was thick with tension, with the metallic scent of impending battle. Mark's small, battered force of loyalists prepared for a fight they knew they could not win through strength of numbers. Their hope was not in their swords, but in the king and queen who now stood among them. Mark donned his armor. It was dented and scratched, the armor of a warrior, not a distant ruler. As he fastened the last buckle, Helen came to stand beside him. She wore no armor, only a simple dark tunic. Her power was her shield. Her resolve was her sword. He looked at her, his heart aching with a love so fierce it almost brought him to his knees. "I am sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything." "There is nothing to forgive," she replied, her hand finding his. "We were both trapped. Now, we are free." Their bond hummed between them, a tangible line of silver light that only they could see. It was stronger than it had ever been, a symphony of shared thoughts and emotions. He was the wolf, the fury, the unyielding strength of the earth. She was the moon, the magic, the untouchable grace of the sky. They were two halves of a single soul, finally made whole. In the final moments before the battle, they stepped away from the others into a small clearing bathed in the eerie red light. "Before we face them," Mark began, taking both of her hands in his, "I would have you as my queen, not by law or by ceremony, but by choice, by my soul." "And I would have you as my king," she answered, her glowing eyes meeting his, "by my heart, by my magic." It was their own ceremony, witnessed only by the bleeding moon. There were no priests, no crowns. There was only a vow. He leaned in, and in a gesture as old as their kind, he gently bit the side of her neck, marking her as his. She gasped, a jolt of pure energy surging through the bond. Then she rose on her toes and did the same to him, her own mark of love and possession. It was not a claim of ownership. It was a promise of unity, a declaration that wherever one went, the other would follow, even into death. They walked out of the ravine hand in hand, a king of shadows and a queen of light. Before them, on the plains below, Riker's army was assembled, a sea of dark fur and gleaming steel. The blood moon reached its apex, hanging directly overhead like a great wounded eye. The final battle had begun. Chapter 22. The King of Beasts, the Queen of Stars. Under the blood-red eye of the moon, the two armies clashed. It was a maelstrom of snarling fur and ringing steel. At its center, two titans met. Mark shed his human form, exploding into a massive black wolf whose shadow seemed to drink the crimson light. Across from him, Riker shifted into a grizzled, monstrous beast, a creature of raw muscle and scarred hide. Their battle was not a dance. It was an earthquake. They crashed into each other with a sound like boulders splitting apart, jaws snapping, claws gouging deep furrows in the earth. Mark was faster, more fluid, his rage honed to a razor's edge by love and righteous fury. But Riker was a brute, a creature of relentless, dirty fighting. He used his warriors to harry Mark's flanks, forcing the black wolf to divide his attention. Helen stood on a small rise overlooking the battlefield, a calm anchor in the heart of the storm. She was not a bystander. She was a commander. With a gesture, she sent a sheet of slick, black ice spreading across the ground in front of Riker's reinforcements, sending them sliding into chaos. With a focused glare, she flashed a burst of blinding silver light, disorienting an archer who had taken aim at one of Mark's loyalists. She was not fighting the battle for him. She was ensuring it was a fair one. The fight between the Alphas was brutal. Riker, seeing his forces falter, grew desperate. He feigned a retreat, and as Mark pursued, he spun and threw a subordinate directly into Mark's path. The moment of hesitation was all he needed. Riker slammed his full weight into Mark, sending him tumbling. He pinned the black wolf down, his massive paws on Mark's chest. Riker's jaws, dripping with saliva, opened wide and lunged for the killing bite at Mark's throat. Time seemed to stop. Helen felt Mark's imminent death through their bond, a flash of searing agony. "No!" Her scream was not a sound of fear. It was a command. She thrust both hands forward. A beam of pure, concentrated moonlight, a river of liquid starlight and absolute zero erupted from her. It was not a wave of frost. It was a lance of lunar fire. It struck Riker in the shoulder. He howled, a sound of unimaginable pain, as the cold fire seared his flesh, burning him with a cold so intense it felt like he was being torn apart atom by atom. He was thrown from Mark's body, his shoulder smoking with silver mist. Mark scrambled to his feet, his black fur bristling. He looked at Helen, and in that moment, their souls aligned. He was the darkness. She was the light. He was the fury. She was the focus. They moved as one. She sent a wave of disorienting light into Riker's eyes, blinding him. As he staggered back, she froze the ground beneath his feet, trapping him. He was a stationary target. Before Riker could even roar in frustration, Mark was upon him. It was no longer a fight. It was an execution. The black wolf's jaws closed around the rival Alpha's throat, and with a final, definitive wrench, the battle was over. Chapter 23. The Price of Treason. Silence fell over the battlefield, broken only by the whimpering of Riker's defeated warriors. His army, seeing their invincible leader fall, threw down their weapons and surrendered. The bloody light of the moon seemed to soften, its duty done. Mark, back in his human form, stood over the body of his rival. He was covered in blood, his and his enemies', but he stood tall, no longer a broken king, but a victorious one. He turned his gaze from the dead Alpha to the living traitors. Lord Kale and his men had already seized Valerius, dragging the stunned old wolf before his king. Valerius stared, his face a mask of disbelief. His perfect plan, decades in the making, had been undone not by politics or armies, but by a power he had dismissed as a myth. "You have betrayed your kingdom." Mark's voice was quiet, but it carried across the silent field with the weight of granite. "You have betrayed your Alpha. You have betrayed the memory of a hero you condemned to lies." There was no trial. The treason had been witnessed by all. Mark looked at Lord Kyle and gave a single, sharp nod. "The price for treason is blood." Kyle drew his sword, and the sentence was carried out swiftly, an absolute and brutal end to the corruption that had plagued the throne for a generation. The other nobles who had stood with Valerius, including a terrified Lady Anya, fell to their knees in the mud, bowing their heads. They trembled, not just before the wrath of their king, but before the silent, glowing woman who stood at his side. They were no longer silenced by fear of a king's temper. They were silenced by awe of a queen's power. The aftermath was a blur of grief and relief. They tended to their wounded, mourning the loyal wolves who had fallen in the battle. The exhaustion was bone deep, a heavy blanket that settled over them all. Helen moved among the wounded, her lumaris gift now a gentle, soothing light that eased pain and mended torn flesh. She was no longer a symbol of controversy. She was a beacon of hope. As the first hints of dawn began to break, painting the eastern sky in soft shades of gray and rose, the exhaustion finally gave way. The war was over. The lie was dead. They had won. Mark came to her, his face weary but his eyes clear for the first time. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, and for a long moment they just stood there, two survivors in the quiet aftermath of a storm, holding each other up. Chapter 24. The open gate weeks later, the Great Hall was filled once more, but the atmosphere was not one of forced celebration or political maneuvering. A quiet, hopeful reverence filled the space. The kingdom was healing, not just from its battle, but from its long-held sickness of lies and hierarchy. At the front of the hall, two thrones sat side by side. A joint coronation was held, a ceremony the likes of which the kingdom had never seen. Mark was reaffirmed as the Alpha King, his authority now unquestioned, his power settled and calm. Beside him, Helen was crowned. She wore a simple gown of deep blue, the color of a twilight sky, embroidered with a constellation of silver moons. As Lord Kale placed the delicate silver circlet upon her head, the crowd did not just cheer for their Luna Queen. They cheered for the girl who had been one of them, who had been cast out and had returned as their savior. When the cheers subsided, Helen stepped forward to issue her first decree. Her voice, once a timid whisper, rang with a clear, calm authority that commanded the attention of every soul in the room. "I remember standing outside these doors," she began, her gaze sweeping over the assembled court, the guards and the servants who now stood freely among the nobles. "I remember being locked out in the cold while others feasted. I remember believing that some of us were meant for the warmth and others were meant for the shadows." She paused, letting the memory hang in the air. "That belief is a poison. It is a lie that weakens the pack from within. It ends today." Her voice rose, filled with the power of her new station. "As my first act as your queen, I decree that the gates of this castle and the doors of this great hall will never again be locked to those who seek shelter. Rank will not determine who is worthy of warmth. Omega, Beta, Alpha, we are one pack. No one will be left in the cold again." A stunned silence was followed by a roar of approval so loud it seemed to shake the castle's very foundations. It was a cheer not just for a new law, but for a new era. Later that evening, she stood with Mark on the grand balcony, looking out over the peaceful, starlit kingdom. He took her hand, his touch warm and familiar. The core question that had haunted her for so long, "Am I truly worthy?" had finally been answered. Her worth was not something given to her by a mate or a crown. It was the power that had been inside her all along. She was no longer the forgotten Omega shivering in the darkness. She was the unforgettable queen who had brought a new dawn. Thank you so much for watching this video. We really appreciate you spending your time with us. If you enjoyed what you saw, we've got a whole library of other videos packed with more great content just like this waiting for you on our channel. So, why not dive into another one right now? And hey, if you want to make sure you don't miss out on our next upload, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. We'd love to have you join our community and see you in the next video. Thanks again.